Now, what I'm going to do with this video is start out by giving you my general thoughts on the novelization of The Last Jedi, and letting you know how it, overall, compares to the movie, before then delving into some of, but certainly not all of, the things that we learned in the book that we didn't learn in the movie. Also, this video is neither meant as an attack or a defense of The Last Jedi, though it may feel like both at times. It's meant to be as fair as an analysis and review as I can give. And with that said, let me start out by answering a couple general questions, starting with, does this book make the movie better or maybe even worse? Simply put, it does neither. The movie, love it or hate it, is what it is and it has to stand on its own. That being said, was the story told better in the novelization than it was in the movie? To that I would say yes, for the most part it was. Now, that doesn't exactly mean I love that story, and if you've watched any of my other videos about The Last Jedi, you know I have some issues with the movie. But I did, for what it's worth, enjoy the story in the book more than I did in the movie. Then again, books have a lot of luxuries that movies do not the least of which is being able to go into characters' thoughts and feelings, or being able to give us information that a movie can't do without it coming off as blatant exposition. Anyway, yes, the story in the book is presented in a way that is clearer and, for me, a bit more enjoyable than the one given to us in the movie. There are a few added lines in the book that tend to fill in what many consider plot holes in the movie. In fact, there are just enough such instances of this that it almost feels like this book is a direct response to people's criticisms about those plot holes or other problems with the movie. Whether or not that's actually the case is hard to say. The logistics of having this book written and then produced in mass quantity in a relatively short amount of time since the movie came out makes me believe that it can't be the case. However, last-minute changes or additions to the book likely could have been made after the movie came out and still allowed plenty of time for production of the book. And I'm not trying to sound like a conspiracy theorist here, but for the most part, all the dialogue in the book, excluding new or extended scenes, is lifted almost 100% from the movie. In other words, the book is almost a word-for-word match to the movie, which was not the case with the novelization of The Force Awakens, for example. And it's a near-perfect match except for when characters are saying something that seems to fill in a plot hole or explain something that wasn't made clear in the movie, and probably should have been. Now, that doesn't happen a lot, mind you, but it happened enough that I at least took note of it. But that wasn't the only way this book tried to help the story given to us in the movie, which really does make me wonder if changes or additions were indeed made to the book after the release of the movie. Or if Jason Fry, who of course wrote this, is just that talented of an author and he recognized these problems before the movie ever came out and adjusted the story accordingly. For example, one of my problems with the movie is why did the Resistance initially jump to where they did after the attack on their base on Dakar? Why jump to the middle of nowhere? Or if it was their intent to go to Crate all along, why not just jump directly there considering, as far as they knew of course, being tracked through hyperspace was impossible? Well, the book explains that wasn't their original intent, going to Crate I mean. Instead, they were basically jumping to an old rebellion rendezvous point where they planned to assess the situation and then figure out their next move. And that's fine and good, and I guess explains that mystery. The book then also lets us know that Crate was an uncharted system, which kind of explains how the First Order didn't know where they might be headed while they ceaselessly chased them, which is an issue I had and addressed in a previous video. Because I just couldn't see how the First Order, or Poe mind you, didn't think to check their course, even if it might appear they were going nowhere and just trying to get away. And making Crate an uncharted system almost works to solve that problem, if it wasn't for the pesky sun that is seen in the skies above Crate and should have been seen by the First Order and Poe and the Resistance as they drew ever closer and then into the system. In fact, the sun should have sent up red flags for the First Order about what the Resistance might be up to, and also made Poe wonder if maybe Holdo did have a plan that she just wasn't sharing with him. And speaking of that, it never really gets addressed as to why Holdo didn't tell Poe the plan, even though he was a hothead who might go as far as to commit a mutiny, which he of course did. The only real explanation ever given is when Poe asks Leia why Holdo didn't just tell him the plan, and Leia simply says the less people who knew the better, though she didn't explain why that was the case. I can only imagine that Holdo was worried about deserters being captured by the First Order and telling them the plan. However, if Holdo had just told them the plan in the first place, they likely wouldn't have tried to desert. Well, at least in the novelization we learned Poe did contemplate that maybe Holdo might be a traitor because of the way she was acting, which I think a lot of people watching the movie for the first time also thought. We also learn a few other details in the book about the slow space chase that helps clear up some of the other things that felt off or people had issues with, like the fact that it was Snoke who ordered Kylo Ren and the other TIE fighters to stop their attack and retreat when the Resistance cruisers got out of range of the Star Destroyers, which, although it still doesn't make a ton of sense why they would do that, especially when the book goes out of its way to tell us just how huge the First Order fleet is and how much military might they have at their disposal. But it does, I guess, at least explain why Kylo Ren obeyed the order and returned since it was given by Snoke. Another thing we learn is why the First Order was just content to chase the Resistance fleet, and that was because they had reports that no help was coming for them, that they were completely on their own. Because we also learn in the book that the New Republic wasn't completely wiped out, but any ships that survived the destruction of the Hosnian system were basically just returning home to protect their worlds instead of creating a unified front against the First Order. We even learned that Snap Wexley and other pilots we saw in The Force Awakens were sent to try and recruit them into the Resistance, which explains why those characters weren't in the movie. Also, during Kylo's TIE fighter attack on the Resistance fleet, we find out that what caused Kylo to hesitate was that he sensed his mother, as we did see in the movie, but what truly halted him was that he felt that she was worried not for herself or the fleet, but for him, and that she really wasn't even angry at him, but just wanted him to come home still. And we do learn in the book that Kylo is, or was, a very conflicted individual. And I say was because after he kills Snoke, he finally seems completely committed to the dark side. Anyway, going back to that initial TIE fighter attack, and when the bridge was blown up and Leia was sent hurtling out into the vacuum of space. The explanation the book gives as to how she got back into the ship was that, after Endor, Luke had indeed taught Leia some of the basics of using the Force, at least how to sense and feel the Force and open herself up to it, and that what she essentially did was use the microscopic lifeforms that had also been jettisoned out into space as almost a ladder back to the ship. And I'll just leave that explanation there and you can do what you want with it. Another thing this book tries very hard to do is explain why Rey is so adept at, well, pretty much everything. In fact, we learn that when Kylo Ren was mind-probing Rey in The Force Awakens, and she began to push back and tell him about his fears, Kylo Ren retreated and opened his mind up completely to her, at which point, and I'm quoting the book here, it was as if his training had become hers. So essentially, she just downloaded all the training she needed from him, not unlike Neo in The Matrix apparently. And here I thought the light side wasn't the quick and easy path, and that part of the trick to wielding the light side was also being calm and at peace, and being able to know the light from the dark. My only hope is that in Episode 9, Rey having amassed so much power so quickly, without the wisdom to use it properly, will be something the movie touches upon. Furthermore, it's explained that Rey has trained extensively and pretty much daily with her staff while she lived on Jakku. She even berates herself at one point that days have gone by on the island where she neglects to practice with it, which of course precedes the scene in the movie where she's practicing with her staff before switching to the lightsaber. And speaking of days going by, in the book it is made clear that she is on the island for several days, though I don't know how this lines up with the slow space chase that, according to the movie, lasted 18 hours. Because we have to keep in mind the First Order knew exactly where the Resistance base was. Hell, they were even targeting it with Starkiller Base at the end of The Force Awakens. So just how long did the Resistance linger before starting to evacuate, knowing that the First Order would be coming? I'd have to imagine they'd have to try to be on their way pretty much immediately, though they did have time for a funeral for Han, which, though rumored to be in the movie forever, wasn't, but it did make its way into the book and was fine. The fact that Lando, Luke, and others weren't there kind of made it feel a little irrelevant, which is why it probably didn't make its way to the movie. The book also opens with a dream Luke is having where he sees the life he would have had if he hadn't followed damned old Obi-Wan on some fool idealistic crusade, and although it was a fine scene and all, it really didn't do much for the story either, much like the Han funeral. One thing I was really hoping for out of the book, but didn't get, was more interaction between Rey and Kylo Ren during their Force Skype sessions. I thought it might be interesting to expand on those and really start to explain why, after talking to him for a total of maybe less than 5 minutes, she was ready to turn herself in to try and save him. Unfortunately, this was again another case of the book being word for word the same as the movie, and nothing was expanded upon at all here. And speaking of Rey going to Kylo, just how did she know where to find him? I mean, in the book it even says the Falcon came out of hyperspace right between the two fleets and launched the escape pod Rey was in towards the Supremacy, where Kylo of course was. And I'd really love to know how Rey and Chewie knew just where to go. I mean, did they follow the tracker that Leia had initially given to Rey? And if so, how did they know the Resistance was being pursued by Kylo in the First Order when they'd been unable to establish communications? And if Rey just knew through the Force where Kylo was, how come Kylo didn't know just where Rey was? And how did Snoke not know where Rey was either? He can reach out across the galaxy and find her mind and connect it to Kylo, even though he's never met her before, but can't sense where that mind actually is? That sounds unlikely. And speaking of Snoke, we learn that his grand plan was to essentially haunt Ben Solo until Luke took an interest in him and would attempt to save him via training him, but that Snoke was confident he could corrupt Ben enough to eventually turn on Luke and break him mentally, which is of course essentially what happened. We also learn that Luke considered the shadow that was hovering over Ben even before he was born, which was initially learned about in Aftermath, something that was normal. He even said, "The brighter the light, the greater the shadow." But what really doesn't make sense to me, and actually the book made this worse in a way because it explained it a lot more, is why did Snoke then take on Ben, or Kylo, as an apprentice after Ben had essentially mentally crippled Luke Skywalker by turning on him? I mean, Luke had run off and exiled himself, and Snoke had no one to challenge him. So why not just kill Kylo instead of training him and risk the light rising to challenge Kylo and risk bringing Luke and the Jedi back at some point? I mean, if Snoke never trains Kylo, then in theory, Rey never comes about. Because apparently somehow Snoke doesn't cause the light to rise up and challenge him. He even says in both the book and movie that he thought Luke would be a counter to Kylo, and says nothing about anything or anyone being a counter to him. So why take on Kylo Ren and risk a powerful light side user rising? In the book, he even expresses doubt about what to do with Kylo, and even seems to contemplate destroying him because he's not living up to his potential. Well, that is, he contemplates destroying him up until the moment he's convinced Kylo is about to kill Rey, at which point he believes he's finally gotten rid of his weakness, but of course ends up dead. Then there's perhaps the biggest reveal in the book, at least in my opinion, and it was a line about the cosmic force. And if you don't know, the Force is made up of two parts. There's the living Force, which, as the name implies, is created by all living things. And then there's the cosmic Force, which all living things become a part of after they die. New life then comes forth from the cosmic Force, and the cycle goes on and on forever. Anyway, in the book, it says in reference to the cosmic Force, and I again quote here, "It had an awareness and a purpose and a will," which is something I discussed in a recent video of mine, about how it feels like, in the sequel trilogy, the Force is less of an ambiguous energy field and more like a deity of some kind. This line about it having an awareness kind of confirms that, which to me is disappointing. Personally, I like the idea that the Force is not self-aware in any way, shape, or form, and what the will of the Force simply is an innate desire for the Force to simply be in a balanced state, and that Jedi can become in tune with this Force and this will. But I guess that's not the case. I guess the Force, like a god, makes conscious choices. And speaking of choices, sadly, Luke's choice to shut himself off from the Force isn't elaborated upon any more in this book than it was in the movie. As I mentioned before, we learn that his fall and Ben's betrayal of him was all an evil plot designed by Snoke, and the book even says in reference to Luke activating his saber over the sleeping Ben Solo that it almost felt unwilling, which I found interesting, though I'm not sure it was really meant to imply anything. His relationship with Rey also isn't expanded upon much either. Again, what you got in the movie is pretty much what you got in the book. We do learn why he was in full Jedi regalia at the end of The Force Awakens, however, and that's because he just made an attempt to burn down the tree with the ancient books in it, but had failed, which something tells me isn't what JJ originally had in mind, but that's not what it is. Overall, this book was very true to the movie, other than a few added scenes and lines here and there. As I've said, most of the time it was a word-for-word match to the movie, other than the few expanded scenes or when a line was added to apparently help fill a plot hole. It's called the Expanded Edition, but really it felt like the try and fill in some of the plot holes edition. And that's not to say this isn't a well-written book. Jason Fry is not only a terrific Star Wars writer, but a terrific writer in general. His love for this universe really comes through in some of the small details he adds, like the fact that they were playing Pazaak on Canto Bight, a game anyone who has played Knights of the Old Republic will remember. He also gave us references and connections in the story to a great many of the other sources of canon, which, as someone who keeps up with all that, was very much appreciated. Some are even heavily referenced, like the book Leia, Princess of Alderaan, where we learn about Leia and Holdo's early days and friendship. We even had a mention of Inferno Squad and their mission to get allies, which was a reference to the campaign mode in Battlefront 2. But despite this being a well-written book, I again go back to what I said at the start. The movie is what it is, and this book neither makes it better nor worse. If you love the movie, you're probably going to love this book. If you hated the movie, you'll either appreciate the effort to fill in the plot holes, or just roll your eyes and get angry that they're addressing them after the fact, when in all honesty, the movie itself should have never left them there in the first place. Things like the Finn and Rose side adventure are made no worse or better in this book, or given any more relevancy. We are given the impression that Rose is slowly falling for Finn as the story goes on, and that she even dislikes when Finn talks about Rey, as if there's some jealousy there. We do at least get it explained why towards the end of the movie, after Rose crashes into Finn and stops him from sacrificing himself, why the First Order walkers don't fire on the two as they retreat across the wide open expanse. And that's simply because, and this is another quote straight from the book, and from the mind of Rose, who also wonders why they're not being killed. They don't think we matter because they think they've won. DJ is another character who isn't expanded upon at all either in this book, nor is Phasma given any additional scenes or dialogue. She's still as pointless as ever, and the book makes no effort to fix one of the biggest inconsistencies in the movie. That being how Phasma is overseeing the execution of Finn and Rose when the Supremacy is hit by the Raddus, yet when Finn and Rose come to shortly thereafter, Phasma is gone, only to then come in later with an entourage of stormtroopers. One is left wondering why Phasma apparently woke up first, left those two there unconscious instead of just killing them, and went and got a bunch of stormtroopers. And speaking of the Raddus hitting the Supremacy, this is not touched on at all in the book, or should I say, it's not really explained why this has never been done before, at least as far as we've seen. In fact, just like in the movie, the bridge crew of the Supremacy seems clueless as to what the Raddus might be doing as it turns around, only to realize it at the last moment. It's almost as if using hyperspace as a weapon is some unspoken galactic law, something that you just don't do because, I don't know. To me, if it works, and it apparently does, it seems like something that should have and would have been weaponized a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Well, that's all I've got for this time. Now it's your turn to tell me if you've read the novelization and what you think about it. So leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.